Questions and answers. Now, as promised, I will ask and answer a few general questions. My first is a compound question. Isn't this list of psychological tendencies tautological to some extent compared to the system of Euclid? That is, aren't there overlaps in the tendencies? And couldn't the system be laid out just as plausibly in a somewhat different way? The answers are yes, yes, and yes, but this matters only moderately. Further refinement of these tendencies, while desirable, has a limited practical potential because a significant amount of messiness is unfixable in a soft science like psychology. My second question is, can you supply a real-world model instead of a Milgram-type controlled psychology experiment that uses your system to illustrate multiple psychological tendencies interacting in a plausibly diagnosable way? The answer is yes. One of my favorite cases involves the McDonnell Douglas airliner evacuation test. Before a new airliner can be sold, the government requires that it pass an evacuation test, during which a full load of passengers must get out in some short period of time. The government directs that the test be realistic. So you can't pass by evacuating only 20-year-old athletes. So McDonnell Douglas scheduled such a test in a darkened hangar using a lot of old people as evacuees. The passenger cabin was, say, 20 feet above the concrete floor of the hangar and was to be evacuated through moderately flimsy rubber chutes. The first test was made in the morning. There were about 20 very serious injuries, and the evacuation took so long it flunked the time test. So what did McDonnell Douglas next do? It repeated the test in the afternoon, and this time there was another failure, with about 20 more serious injuries, including one case of permanent paralysis. What psychological tendencies contributed to this terrible result? Well, using my tendency list as a checklist, I come up with the following explanation. Reward. Super response tendency drove McDonnell Douglas to act fast. It couldn't sell its airliner until it passed the test. Also pushing the company was doubt avoidance tendency with its natural drive to arrive at a decision and run with it. Then the government's direction that the test be realistic drove authority misinfluence tendency into the mischief of causing McDonnell Douglas to overreact by using what was obviously too dangerous a test method. By now, the course of action had been decided, so inconsistency, avoidance tendency helped preserve the near-idiotic plan. When all the old people got to the dark hangar with its high airline cabin and concrete floor, the situation must have made McDonnell Douglas employees very queasy. But they saw other employees and supervisors not objecting. Social proof tendency, therefore, swamped the queasiness. And this allowed continued action as planned, a continuation that was aided by more authority misinfluence tendency. Then came the disaster of the morning test with its failure, plus serious injuries. McDonnell Douglas ignored the strong disconfirming evidence from the failure of the first test because confirmation bias, aided by the triggering of strong deprival superreaction tendency, favored maintaining the original plan. McDonnell Douglas's deprival superreaction tendency was now like that which causes a gambler, bent on getting even after a huge loss, to make his final big bet. After all, McDonnell Douglas was going to lose a lot if it didn't pass its test as scheduled. More psychology-based explanation can probably be made, but the foregoing discussion is complete enough to demonstrate the utility of my system when used in a checklist mode. My third question is also compound. In the practical world, what good is the thought system laid out in this list of tendencies? Isn't practical benefit prevented because these psychological tendencies are so thoroughly programmed into the human mind by broad evolution, the combination of genetic and cultural evolution, that we can't get rid of them? Well, the answer is that the tendencies are probably much more good than bad. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there, working pretty well for man, given his condition and his limited brain capacity. So the tendencies can't be simply washed out automatically and shouldn't be. Nevertheless, the psychological thought system described, when properly understood and used, enables the spread of wisdom and good conduct and facilitates the avoidance of disaster. Tendency is not always destiny, and knowing the tendencies and their antidotes can often help prevent trouble that would otherwise occur. Here is a short list of examples reminding us of the great utility of elementary psychological knowledge. 1. Braun's communication practices. 2. The use of simulators in pilot training. 3. The system of Alcoholics Anonymous. 4th. Clinical training methods in medical schools. 5. The rules of the U.S. Constitutional Convention. Totally secret meetings, no recorded vote by name until the final vote, votes reversible at any time before the end of the convention, then just one vote on the whole Constitution. These are very clever psychology-respecting rules. If the founders had used a different procedure, many people would have been pushed by various psychological tendencies into inconsistent, hardened positions. The elite founders got our Constitution through by a whisker, only because they were psychologically acute. 6. The use of Granny's incentive-driven rule to manipulate oneself toward better performance of one's duties. 7. The Harvard Business School's emphasis on decision trees. When I was young and foolish, I used to laugh at the Harvard Business School. I said, they're teaching 28-year-old people that high school algebra works in real life. But later, I wised up and realized that it was very important that they do that to counter some bad effects from psychological tendencies. Better late than never. 8. The use of autopsy equivalents at Johnson & Johnson. At most corporations, if you make an acquisition and it turns out to be a disaster, all the people, paperwork, and presentations that caused the foolish acquisition are quickly forgotten. Nobody wants to be associated with the poor outcome by mentioning it. But at Johnson & Johnson, the rules make everybody revisit old acquisitions, comparing predictions with outcomes. That is a very smart thing to do. 9. The great example of Charles Darwin as he avoided confirmation bias, which has morphed into the extreme anti-confirmation bias method of the double-blind studies wisely required in drug research by the F.D.A. 10. The Warren Buffett rule for open-outcry auctions. Don't go. My 4th question is, what special knowledge problems lie buried in the thought system demonstrated by your list? Well, one answer is paradox. In social psychology, the more people learn about the system, the less it is true. And this is what gives the system its great value as a preventer of bad outcomes and a driver of good outcomes. This result is paradoxical and doesn't remind one of elementary physics, but so what? One can't get all the paradox out of pure math, so why should psychology be shocked by some paradox? There is also some paradox in cognition change that works even when the manipulated person knows he is being manipulated. This creates a sort of paradox in a paradox, but again, so what? I once much enjoyed an occasion of this sort. I drew this beautiful woman as my dinner partner many years ago. I'd never seen her before. She was married to a prominent Los Angeles man. She sat down next to me, turned her beautiful face up and said, "Charlie, what one word accounts for your remark, able success in life?" I knew I was being manipulated by a practiced routine, and I just loved it. I never see this woman without a little lift in my spirits. And, by the way, I told her I was rational. You'll have to judge yourself whether that's true. I may be demonstrating some psychological tendency I hadn't planned on demonstrating. My 5th question is, don't we need more reconciliation of psychology and economics? My answer is yes, and I suspect that some slight progress is being made. I have heard of one such example. Colin Cameron of Caltech, who works in experimental economics, devised an interesting experiment in which he caused high IQ students playing for real money to pay price A plus B for a security they knew would turn into $1 at the end of the day. This foolish action occurred because the students were allowed to trade with each other in a liquid market for the security. And some students then paid price A plus B because they hoped to unload on other students at a higher price before the day was over. What I will now confidently predict is that, despite Cameron's experimental outcome, most economics and corporate finance professors who still believe in the hard-form efficient market hypothesis will retain their original belief. If so, this will be one more indication of how irrational smart people can be when influenced by psychological tendencies. My sixth question is, don't moral and prudential problems come with knowledge of these psychological tendencies? The answer is yes. For instance, psychological knowledge improves persuasive power and, like other power, it can be used for good or ill. Captain Cook once played a psychology-based trick on his seamen to cause them to eat sauerkraut and avoid scurvy. In my opinion, this action was both ethical and wise under the circumstances, despite the deliberate manipulation involved. But ordinarily, when you try to use your knowledge of psychological tendencies in the artful manipulation of someone whose trust you need, you will be making both a moral and prudential error. The moral error is obvious. The prudential error comes because many intelligent people, targeted for conscious manipulation, are likely to figure out what you are trying to do and resent your action. My final question is, aren't there factual and reasoning errors in this talk? The answer is yes, almost surely yes. The final revision was made from memory over about 50 hours by a man 81 years old, who never took a course in psychology and has read none of it, except one book on developmental psychology, for nearly 15 years. Even so, I think the totality of my talk will stand up very well, and I hope all my descendants and friends will carefully consider what I have said. I even hope that more psychology professors will join me in 1. Making heavy use of inversion. 2. Driving for a complete description of the psychological system so that it works better as a checklist. And 3. Especially emphasizing effects from combinations of psychological tendencies. Well, that ends my talk. If in considering what I have said, you had 10% the fun I had saying it, you were lucky recipients.